Hi, I'm Dr. Jean Fourie, and today we're talking about auditory impairments. This is the second lecture on auditory perception. The first lecture dealt with the structure of the ear. This one deals with auditory impairments, and the third lecture will deal with how to support learners who have auditory difficulties. So hearing loss affects a lot of people worldwide, and the estimates are approximately 1 in 6 adults will have a hearing loss worldwide. So it's a very common condition, and it's important for us as educators to be aware of what is happening when learners have a hearing loss. So this lecture will look at what hearing loss is, the levels of hearing loss, types of loss, the age of onset, and the etiology, which is causes of hearing loss. So one of the things that we'll be looking at is South African Sign Language in the next lecture, and there is the sign spelt out in the letters of hello for sign language. Many people who have made very good careers and done a lot of important things regardless of their hearing loss. And there you can see some examples of people who have lost hearing or been born with a hearing loss and yet have become musicians and authors and actresses and done important things. So let's have a quick reminder of what the structure of the ear looks like. There's the external ear, the middle ear, and then the inner ear. So we went through the structure in the previous lecture, and these structures we're going to have a look at again because at any of the stages there can be problems that affect the functioning of the external ear or the middle ear or the inner ear, and this can have an impact on hearing loss. So I want to have a look very briefly at some of the common things that cause hearing loss. And it's often our exposure, exposing the very fine structures of the ear to things, to sounds that are going to cause damage to hearing. So we often have very high sounds, very loud sounds, and an exposure through hearing, through auditory things that we are hearing, and these things will cause damage to the very fine structures in the ears. So we know that a lot of people are engaging in what's called risky behavior regarding unprotected hearing and exposing their ears to sounds that are going to, in the long run, cause some kind of damage. So as educators, please be aware that children should and teenagers should be warned of the difficulties that they can have with hearing loss if they are engaging in any of these behaviors. So I now want to go on and have a look at early identification of hearing loss. And so the screening for babies, for children who are born with hearing loss is a crucial element that needs to take place. So the earlier that one identifies a hearing loss and does some intervention, the minimal impact that it will have on the child's development. So we know that all newborn children, when they're born, should be screened. There's brief screening tests that doctors should do, and they should be screened regularly at their checkups when they go to see the clinic sister. And if anyone suspects that there is some kind of hearing loss, a medical doctor should be seen, and they might refer the child to an audiologist. An audiologist is a person who specializes in the diagnosing and the treating of hearing loss and anything to do with the balance problems in the ear as well. The doctor might also refer the child to an ENT, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, and these are people who deal very specifically with the structure of the ears and which is connected to the nose and the throat. And we looked last time at the functioning of the eustachian tube, which connects the ear to the nasal cavity. So please be aware that early screening is an essential part of what should happen to children's development. As they're developing, they should be regularly checked to see that the ears are functioning and that there is no hearing loss that is happening at any time. So if one suspects a hearing loss, the child should always be tested, and there are audiologists, there are specialized audiologists, which are pediatric audiologists, and as I said, babies should be tested at birth, and there are various different screening tests that can be done to pick up whether the child is losing their hearing. There's an otoacoustic emissions test, which will pick up very slight losses. There is an auditory brainstem response test, where the auditory nerves themselves are measured with little electrodes, little sensors that are put onto the brain, and then to see if the auditory nerve is picking up sensors itself. So there are a variety of tests. At 6 weeks, at the 6-week checkup, after a baby has been born, there is a behavioral test. So if loud noises are made to the side or behind the baby's head, the child should automatically move their head in that direction. And then if one suspects any hearing losses, there is a pure tone audiometry test, which sends very specific pitches or sound frequencies and intensities. We spoke about intensity being the amplitude of the sound wave, and that is measured in decibels. So an audiologist will send these very specific pitches and loudnesses, intensities, through a set of earphones which are well calibrated, so that they can determine exactly which the sounds are that the person cannot hear. And then there is another kind of test, a tympanometric test. And this is a procedure which has a look at the eardrum, the tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. And the eardrum should be moving up and down as the air pressure is going down the auditory canal and hitting it. So this particular test will determine if the eardrum is moving adequately or if there is some kind of difficulty with the eardrum moving. So once the level of hearing loss has been determined, then they will start looking to see what is the different, what type of hearing loss has the person got, and that will help people with determining the appropriate interventions that need to take place. So there are a variety of factors that influence the individual's difficulties with hearing. The cause of the loss, that's the etiology, what has caused the loss. How much physical damage is there at various parts of the ear to the external inner or middle ear? What is the degree or the level of hearing loss? how much loss is there. So which sounds can the person not hear? And then the extent will also be dependent on whether the loss occurred early or later in life. And this is crucial because it has got to do with whether language was acquired. So if a person has acquired normal speaking language before the loss, although it's traumatic for them, they have understood the structure of language and they've come to some understanding of the world. Whether if the child is born with a hearing loss, then they need to be taught about language through signing and through gestures. So it becomes much more difficult for them to understand the hearing, the world and language. So there are various types of hearing loss, and they are labeled according to where the hearing loss has occurred in the ear. So I'm quickly going to move to the next slide so that you can see the structure of the ear and see what we're talking about with conductive and sensory neural hearing loss. So generally, when there is any damage to the outer ear or even to the tympanic membrane and to the little ossicles, the little bones in the middle ear, that part is all referred to as conductive hearing loss. So this is hearing loss where there is a blockage in the transmission of sound. This type of hearing loss is often caused by ear infections, and the ear can get infected in the middle ear through the eustachian tube, and then the little bones are not able to move properly. There can also be infections in the outer ear itself, and this can also lead to hearing the tympanic membrane not moving adequately. So conductive hearing loss is usually mild and temporary and often treated with medication, and in very rare or extreme cases, they might need to do some surgery to help with that. Then sensory neural hearing loss. This generally refers to any loss that is happening in the inner ear. So you remember that the cochlea sits in the inner ear, and this is that spiral shaped organ which holds the hair cells, which are the auditory little nerves that pick up the vibration that comes from the middle ear and convert it into an electric signal. So with sensory neural hearing loss, the outer ear and the little ossicles might be working perfectly fine. However, the inner ear is unable to convert the sound into electrical signals. So if the electrical signals are not made in the cochlea, that neural pathway does not go into the brain, and so obviously the brain does not receive those signals, and then it doesn't hear the sounds. So this type of hearing loss often exists at birth. So it's often a hereditary or comes from some complications around fetal development or the birthing procedure. And often people don't know what is the cause of it, but this kind of hearing loss is usually permanent, and it usually is very difficult to treat. So sensory neural hearing loss can be mild. So the person cannot hear specific sounds, which means that certain of the little hair cells have been damaged. It can be moderate when there are many sounds that the person cannot hear, or severe where they cannot hear most sounds, or profound where the person cannot hear anything at all. So there are degrees in the level of hearing loss that can occur in sensory neural loss. And then there can be a combination of conductive and sensory neural loss. So this is called mixed hearing loss, and this is when there is both conductive and sensory neural hearing loss, and so it's much more complex, more rare, and more difficult to treat. So it's important for us to understand that hearing loss has got different causes, and there are different types of hearing loss depending on where the loss has occurred. Now, I now want to move on to what happens inside the brain. And this is very, very complicated. We know that there are various different parts of the brain involved in picking up the auditory signal and in integrating it, making sense of it, and deciding whether to act on it and what needs to happen. So we speak of auditory processing disorders. Sometimes this is called central hearing loss, and the ear is working fine. The signals are going through the ear and being picked up by the auditory nerve, but when it gets into the brain, there is a processing problem. So there's a problem with interpreting the signals that are received, with remembering them, with retrieving the auditory information so that the person can make those sounds again or remember the words or the things that were said to them. So we call this a sensory integration problem. The ear is functioning fine, but there are difficulties with the brain receiving the information and making sense of it. So this is that idea of perception is problematic. And this often manifests in children as inattention, daydreaming. The child looks like they're not concentrating on what you're saying. Learning can be inconsistent. They can sometimes pick up things and remember them, and other times not. So an auditory processing disorder can be identified by a speech and language therapist. So if you suspect that children have any difficulties with this, refer them to a speech and language therapist. Then there is auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder. Auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder is also a hearing disorder which occurs in the inner ear, but there is a problem here with sending the sound signal from the ear to the brain. So what happens is that the signal is received by the cochlea, but the cochlea is not sending those signals to the brain in an orderly, organized fashion, not in the way that the brain can understand it. So there are the brain is hearing sounds that aren't happening. So the person will report that all different sounds that one can make for them to hear will sound like static or white noise. And they might also hear different sounds as different things. For instance, if they hear a voice speaking, it might sound the same to them as running water, if you run water out of a tap. Or if there's a dog barking, that sound might sound the same as a car sending its horn. Or they might hear a bird chirping the same as a pan banging. So they will hear sounds, but the sounds are being disordered and disorganized in the brain, and so they are not able to make sense it's a perceptual problem, not able to perceive this properly. And this spectrum disorder, they don't really know what causes it. Sometimes premature babies born very early, there could be a genetic component to it that it's passed down from generation to the next. Sometimes it's caused by severe trauma to the head and the ear, and then this disrupts the fine functioning of the cochlear nerves. So if you have any children who are complaining of hearing difficulties, then please refer them to a speech therapist or an audiologist who will be able to figure out what the difficulties are that the person is experiencing. And auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder is quite rare. The prevalence is about 10% of all cases of hearing loss, but it is something that we need to be aware of as educators. So I now want to go and look at some of the key terms that we need to understand when we're speaking about hearing loss. And these are defined as follows. So with congenital deafness, this is hearing loss that occurs at the time of birth. Congenital, the child has been born with it. It could be a genetic or hereditary deafness, so there's something in the genes or passed down from one generation to the child. It could also have been caused by some infections that occur during pregnancy. So when mothers are pregnant, they should really not be exposed to things like German measles, which is rubella, or some of the viral infections. Some of these can cause complications with the fetal development, and so the child can be born with a congenital hearing loss. Then acquired hearing loss. This is the loss that happens after the child has been born. The child is born with perfectly good hearing, the ears are working, all is fine, but the person becomes hard of hearing. And we've spoken about some of the things that can cause hearing loss: loud noises, exposure to certain chemicals, trauma to the head. All sorts of things can cause a hearing loss. So the next term we need to know is prelingual deafness. Prelingual, this is hearing loss that occurs before language was acquired spontaneously. So the child was deaf either at birth or within the first 2 years of life, because we are acquiring our language within the first 3 years of a little baby. So postlingual deafness is hearing loss that has occurred after language has been acquired. So the person became deaf, something made them go deaf. And these people are often referred to as the deafened. So they have become deaf. And then there's another term that gets used in the literature called functionally deaf. And this is a hearing impairment that results in spoken language development being delayed or absent. And so the person appears to be deaf even though they might not, their hearing might be working fine, they are just not able to learn language. So let's do a quick look at some of the most frequent causes of hearing loss. And as I've said, exposure to loud noises, hereditary, something in the genes, genetic deformities, a natural aging process. As we age, we've exposed our cochlear hearing fine little cells to a lifetime of of sound, and they get, those little fine hairs get damaged, and so it's a natural process that the body has wear and tear, and the hearing will be lost. Head injury, traumatic car accidents, hitting banging the child's head, anything that damages the head has the potential to damage ears. And then there are certain medications called ototoxic medications that can cause hearing loss, and various illnesses that one can be exposed to can also have an influence on the loss of hearing. So here is a brief list of all of those things and giving some a little bit more of the detail there. So all of these things can have an influence on one's hearing, and that they can cause damage to the ear, and so the hearing is compromised. So here is another slide showing the dangers of high noise levels, headphones that are worn for a long time, certain sounds over a certain decibel level will cause damage to ears. And this is quite a nice grading of the noise levels, graded from a whisper, which obviously won't cause any damage to ears, to things that are graded orange and red, such as very loud sirens, aeroplanes, noises, explosions, hand grenades, and power tools, all these things that have the potential to cause damage to our ears. So what happens is hearing loss is graded, and we grade hearing loss according to a continuum. So there's a range of hearing loss from partial loss to hard of hearing, and then it goes all the way to total hearing loss or deafness, where the person cannot hear sounds of 90 decibels and above. So they are unable to hear, you know, the aeroplane going past, or busy streets, or very, very, very loud noises. So hearing loss has a range from people who are having a very partial loss, so there are only certain sounds that they're having difficulty with, sometimes just difficulty hearing people speaking, right up to very, very loud noises. So here is another slide explaining this whole idea of the grading of hearing loss from very fine, slight, mild loss, moderate loss, severe loss, and then profound hearing loss, where one cannot hear sounds that are very, very loud. So have a look and understand how hearing loss is graded from mild to moderate. This next slide shows the loudness and the degrees of hearing loss in a different format, but it also shows the pitch. So you can see at the top where there is, someone can have very fine hearing and hear whispers and tap dripping and birds singing, very, very fine sounds. All the sounds of speech in the yellow range over there, in the yellow band, the sound of a baby crying loudly, dogs barking, aeroplanes and trucks and cars, and very loud music. So these are the ranges of loudness, and then you can see someone who has normal hearing, that they can hear everything that's very, very fine, but someone who has profound hearing loss cannot hear very, very, very loud noises. So that is the range of hearing loss. So when we speak about someone who is deaf, there is a specific way that we speak about this. And we say that a person is considered to be deaf if they cannot hear everyday conversations, even with the best hearing aids. So this person may hear loud noises, but it will be distorted or indistinct. They might only hear certain frequencies. And because one is unable to hear one's own speech, your own speech becomes distorted. And so these people will often stop speaking. They can't hear their speech, so it's difficult to speak. So they will be lip reading, or they will be taught sign language. So deafness, the key definition is that the person cannot hear everyday conversations and sounds that are happening even with the best hearing aid. So that is deafness. When we refer to someone who has a partial hearing loss, this is a degree of hearing loss. They can only hear very high or very low sounds. Sounds may be distorted, and what sounds loud to a normal hearing person will sound very faint to them. They are unable sometimes to distinguish the speech sounds that are being heard from sounds in the background. The background noises interfere. These people may also complain of buzzing or ringing noises in the ears called tinnitus. And this is a high-pitched frequency that the ear itself is generating inside the cochlea. Partial hearing loss may occur in one ear, which is unilateral, or it may occur in both ears. So that is bilateral hearing loss. We then also speak of a condition called auditory integration, and this is related to the previous slide where we spoke about auditory processing disorders. So auditory integration, children can hear, but they're struggling to make sense of what they are hearing. So the teacher might give some instructions, and the child can hear every word, but they can't make sense, put it together, make sense of the language, and remember the words, remember the sentences, and remember the meanings behind it. So children with auditory integration difficulties will often have difficulties following instructions in the classroom and doing the things that teachers are asking them to do orally. So these children should always be supported with the addition of visual information, so writing down the homework on the board, pictures of the concepts that need to be taught, and giving both auditory and visual information simultaneously. That helps everyone, not only the children who have an auditory impairment difficulty. So please remember that hearing loss affects all aspects of a child's development. It affects their language development very, very strongly. It affects their school performance and their emotional development. They can often be isolated from people, have difficulty making friends because their friends don't understand if they can't speak to them. Learning to sign is difficult, and we're going to speak about some of the ways that we can assist children with auditory impairments in the next lecture. So this lecture gave an overview of the different impairments, the types of hearing loss, and how we look at and measure deafness, partial hearing loss, and hard of hearing. Please have a look at the textbook, Addressing Barriers to Learning. There is a chapter in that textbook on hearing impairments. You can go to the website of Deaf South Africa. They have very good resources there. The Center for Deaf Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand also has a very good site where you can refer people to. They will counsel and teach sign language and help with audiology and educating people who are deaf. So that's a very, very nice center to know about. And they have a website called High Hopes where they run home programs for children so that mommies and daddies and children are all learning sign language as a communal language for the child. So you can have a look at a website called Baby Sign Language, and Baby Sign Language gives a whole collection of oh dear, I didn't go through here. Baby Sign Language gives a whole collection of different slides, and these slides give you all the different signs that should be taught to babies and to children. So that ends this lecture, and we will speak about supporting children with auditory impairments in the next lecture. The slides will be up and the lecture recording up on Blackboard as well. So bye for now.